Not every civilization collapses because of war. Not every people are wiped out by an enemy from the outside. Some societies fall apart in silence when people are still alive, still breathing, still laughing and talking. But they have lost the most important thing of all, the truth. Picture a land where the sky once sent rain in its season, where fields once stayed green, and where people were once guided by Allah through sacred law and revealed words. Then, little by little, they began to forget. Not because they lacked knowledge, but because forgetting was convenient. Faith demands discipline while desire promises faster rewards. Their downfall did not arrive like a thunderclap. It came in tiny steps. One law gets softened, one boundary gets blurred, one teaching gets adjusted to fit the times. And then what used to be the exception becomes the rule. What used to be wrong becomes normal. What used to prick the conscience now gets legalized through rituals, through tradition, through power. From that very soil, a symbol is raised, not just stone, not just gold, but the distilled product of fear, greed, and the hunger to dominate. They called it Baal. Baal was not simply a statue, it was a false promise dressed in dazzling form. It told people, worship me and I will give you rain. Bow to me and I will protect your crops. Offer to me and I will grant you children, wealth, and safety. And the people believed. Not because Baal had power, but because they needed something they could control. Allah felt too high, too holy, too just. Baal, on the other hand, stood right in front of them. He could be touched, bought off, negotiated with. So a new civilization was born. A civilization where gold was honored more than truth, where ritual mattered more than obedience, where political power and religious power fused together, ruling through fear and superstition. Baalbek was not just a city. It became the symbol of a society that learned to live with wrongdoing and call it order. There, people bowed every day, not out of humility, but out of fear. They offered sacrifices not out of love, but to bargain. Faith was no longer surrender, it became a transaction. And then, in a world like that, a question appeared. Just one question, but it was enough to shake everything. Do you not fear Allah? That question did not come from a king. It did not come from a military commander. It came from a solitary man with no throne, no army, no worldly power. A man history would remember as the prophet Ilyas, may peace be upon him. Ilyas did not arrive like a revolution. He arrived like a beam of light aimed straight into a room that had grown comfortable with darkness. And the most frightening part was not how strong the light was, but what it revealed. The darkness had been there so long that people had started calling it normal. Welcome to Prophetic History Explained. Today, we are not just telling an ancient story. We are stepping into one of the deepest tragedies in human history, when people see the truth, yet still choose to turn away from it. Because this story is not only about a massive idol that disappeared. It is about a sickness that never disappeared, a sickness that makes people willing to worship anything that promises them power, security, and advantage, as long as they do not have to change themselves. The prophet Ilyas stepped into a society where wrong had become the foundation, where truth was treated like a threat, and where the person who spoke what was right could be labeled the enemy of order. How did a people once blessed by Allah fall this far? Why did they bow to something made by their own hands? And what happened when one man dared to stand up alone and challenge an entire civilization built on lies? If you want to understand why a statue could make a whole nation tremble, and why truth, even when buried, never truly dies, stay with us to the end of this video. Before we continue this tragic and extraordinary journey, subscribe to Prophetic History Explained to support our work so we can keep bringing you more deep, honest, thought-provoking stories about the history of the prophets and timeless lessons for today's world. When the prophet Ilyas began to call people back, he did not enter a neutral society. He walked straight into the center of an established order where every stone, every ritual, every rule served a false belief that was stable. And that stability is exactly what made truth dangerous. Ilyas did not come to negotiate. He did not bring a new theory, and he did not offer partial reforms. He simply repeated what had already been revealed: return to Allah, abandon Baal, stop worshipping what cannot hear, cannot see, cannot bless, and cannot punish. But to the people who benefited from that system, his reminder sounded like a sentence. To the priests of Baal, Ilyas threatened their livelihood. If Baal fell, their power fell with him. To the king, Ilyas was a direct threat. A king might tolerate many things, but he will not tolerate someone reminding the people that the highest authority does not belong to the throne. Because when people bow to Allah, they stop kneeling to men. So Ilyas was given every label: troublemaker, rebel, destroyer of social order. Not because he spoke falsely, but because he spoke the truth about what no one wanted to hear. And in a society where error has become the foundation, truth will always be treated as danger. When the order to hunt him down was issued, Ilyas did not answer with violence. He did not gather forces or try to seize control. He chose the path of the prophets. Trust Allah and withdraw. Mountains became his refuge. Empty valleys became his home. He lived far from the city lights and the roar of crowds, but he never left his mission. 7 years in hiding were 7 years of testing, not only in the body but in the spirit. There were long nights with no reply, days of hunger and thirst, moments of loneliness so deep it felt like the world had forgotten him. Yet in that silence, Ilyas's faith did not weaken. It became purer because nothing remained between him and Allah. Then in the middle of those years, Allah brought Ilyas to a fragile life, weak and suffering, a child who looked like he might not survive. Ilyas became one of the quietest, deepest signs of this mission. When Ilyas made dua, a heartfelt personal prayer for the boy, and Allah granted healing, it was not just a miracle for one family. It was a declaration that even in the darkest era, Allah is still preparing the future. Ilyas was not only healed in his body, he was raised on truth, patience, and the living example of a teacher who held nothing in his hands except faith. In hidden footsteps and lessons taught in the wilderness, the next generation was being formed. When a society turns its back on truth, truth finds a way to survive through quiet people. Meanwhile, in Baalbek, the rage grew. Ilyas's absence did not make the system feel safe. It exposed something terrifying. They feared him even when he was gone, because the idea he planted had started spreading. Once people begin to question Baal, they cannot return to the same blind state they had before. Ilyas understood this. He knew the real battle was not about who controlled the city. It was about who controlled the human heart. That is why, even while hunted, even while living in the shadows, he kept reminding anyone who would listen that truth does not need violence to defend it. It only needs to be spoken firmly and without compromise. In this phase, the mission of the prophet Ilyas was not about winning. It was about endurance. Not about how many followed him, but about the fact that he never stopped calling people back, even when he knew most would turn away. He became the living proof of an eternal principle. Sometimes standing firm alone against the wrong of an entire society is already a victory in the sight of Allah. And from that loneliness, a greater confrontation was forming. Not in the shadows, not in whispers, but in front of the whole nation, under the witness of sky and earth, where truth and falsehood would have nowhere left to hide. When the prophet Ilyas stepped out after years in hiding, he carried no weapon and no army. What he carried was complete certainty that the time had come for heaven and earth to testify to the truth. Because some societies stop responding to warnings and reasoning, and they only wake up when their false faith is exposed in the clearest possible way. Baal was worshipped as the one who controlled rain, harvest, and life. And right there, Allah struck at the core of the lie. When Ilyas's dua was accepted, the sky closed. Not a sudden dry spell, but a heavy silence that stretched on, day after day, turning every sunrise into a question with no answer. At first, people were only uneasy. They thought it was unusual weather. Then unease turned into fear. Water pulled back from rivers and streams, wells dried to dust, fields cracked open. Still, they did not return to Allah. They ran to Baal even more, offered more, pleaded harder. They believed that if the ritual was big enough and the sacrifices were many enough, their idol would respond. But the sky stayed empty. That silence was not just the absence of rain. It was the total absence of any response. And that absence began to shake what seemed unshakable. If Baal truly had power, why did he not answer? If he was Lord of the rain, why was the land dying at his feet? When the drought reached its second year, despair spread. Livestock collapsed, children starved, the elderly weakened. The prayers grew more frantic and more hollow. And by the third year, people began to realize what they were too afraid to say out loud. Maybe what they were worshipping could not hear them at all. That is when the prophet Ilyas appeared again, not as a man celebrating victory, but as a witness. He did not mock them or insult them. He proposed a fair test so they could face their own belief. If Baal was truly a god, let him prove it. Before the whole people, the priests gathered and their rituals began. Their shouting rose into the air. They called his name from morning to noon, from noon to afternoon. But nothing happened. Not a single cloud, not a single sign, not one answer. This silence could no longer be explained away. It became evidence. When it was Ilyas's turn, he did not need elaborate ceremony. He did not need long, dramatic words. He simply turned to Allah, the creator of the heavens and the earth, and prayed with a heart fully surrendered. And in that moment, what human hands could never produce took place. A sign came not to show off, but to end every excuse. The sky, silent for years, shifted. Clouds gathered and rain poured down, or in another narration, fire fell from the sky and consumed the offering in an instant. In that moment, there was no room for doubt. The difference between the all-powerful and a lifeless statue became painfully clear. This was not Ilyas defeating the people. This was Allah forcing them to face the truth they had avoided for far too long. Baal was not defeated by force. He was defeated by his own helplessness. But the most heartbreaking part of the story is not there, because truth, no matter how brilliantly revealed, does not automatically become faith. Many fell to their knees in fear. Many admitted Allah's power, but deep inside they were not ready to abandon Baal. Because abandoning Baal was not only changing belief, it meant abandoning a familiar system, abandoning benefits, abandoning status, abandoning the false comfort of a lie. That moment exposed a bitter rule of human history. Miracles can make people afraid, but only humility can make them change. When fear fades, habits return. When rain falls again, memories of drought begin to blur. The prophet Ilyas knew this better than anyone. He did not imagine that one sign would save an entire nation. He knew signs are only a mirror. Whether people look into that mirror or turn away is the choice of every heart. And here, the line between truth and falsehood no longer lay in the sky. It lay inside the human heart, an invisible line, yet the one that decides the fate of a people. The truth had been displayed before their eyes. No longer a warning whispered in the dark, no longer a quiet test, Heaven had spoken. Earth had answered. Yet the tragedy was not that they failed to see, but that they saw clearly and still chose to turn away. After the rain, after the fear, after the trembling moment before Allah's power, a silence settled. In that silence, it looked like everything might change. But real change demands a price most people are unwilling to pay. Abandoning Baal was not only rejecting a statue, it meant rejecting an entire system of advantage, an entire familiar order, an entire sense of security built on deception. The priests of Baal did not disappear. They went quiet for a while, waiting for fear to cool. They understood people. They knew that memories of pain fade faster than habits formed around power and ritual. The king did not change either. He knew one moment of panic was not enough to break a structure rooted deep in society. Give it time and Baal would stand again in the hearts of the people. And that is exactly what happened. When the land turned green again, when wells filled, when harvest returned, people began to forget. They did not forget the sign, but they learned to set it aside. They told themselves, maybe Allah is powerful, but Baal still has a role. They did not return to shirk, associating partners with Allah, in a loud way. They returned quietly, step by step, until the deviation once again felt normal. That is when the prophet Ilyas understood the issue was no longer evidence. It was the heart. A heart trained to compromise will always find reasons to delay change, and when truth demands sacrifice, most people will choose to keep what they have, even while knowing it is wrong. Ilyas continued to call them back, not with rage, but with grief. He could see the road his people were walking. Not because they did not know Allah, but because they did not want Allah to govern their lives. They wanted a God they could bargain with, a symbol they could manipulate, a faith they could bend to fit personal gain. When that turning away became clear, Allah's command came. Ilyas was ordered to leave them, not because he failed his mission, but because the season of warning had ended. There comes a moment in the history of every people when the door of mercy closes, not because Allah lacks compassion, but because people have locked their own door shut. The departure of Ilyas was itself a sign, a final wake-up call. When a prophet leaves a community, it is never meaningless. It signals that consequences will no longer be delayed. And those consequences did not arrive all at once. They arrived step by step, just as the corruption had arrived. Then came division. Groups began fighting for power with no shared moral center. When Allah is no longer the center, each person makes the self the center. Internal conflict broke out, loyalty shattered, and society became fragile from the inside. In that condition, punishment came, not like a sudden lightning strike, but like a storm that had been announced long before. The Assyrian Empire entered, not facing a united people, but a fractured, weakened society hollowed out in spirit. Cities were torn apart, families were split, those who once boasted were led away in humiliation. This is not a story about random cruelty in history. It is the logical outcome of a choice repeated for years. When people keep rejecting truth, they do not only reject Allah, they strip away the foundation that protects them. Without a moral compass, society becomes prey for any stronger force. The greatest tragedy is that it could have been avoided. They were warned. They were shown. They were given chances to turn back. But they chose the easier road, the road that did not require changing themselves. Their story became a timeless warning. Not every society collapses because it lacks information. Many societies collapse because they have more than enough proof but not enough courage. Courage to leave what is familiar. Courage to accept truth even when it makes life harder. And here, history closes a heavy chapter, not with cheering victory, but with the silence of a people who lost themselves after seeing the light. As the story of the prophet Ilyas nears its end, history does not close with noise or a spectacular win in the eyes of people. It closes in stillness, a heavy stillness, where the symbols once worshipped fade away, leaving only one massive question: what truly matters when everything else falls apart? The departure of the prophet Ilyas, may peace be upon him, is not described like the death of an ordinary man. It carries the weight of a life fully spent on mission. In narrations passed down, whether it is the account of his conversation with the angel of death or the image of fiery horses carrying him from this world, one thing remains clear. Ilyas did not cling to power, fame, or comfort. The only thing that burdened his heart was the thought that his time to worship, to call people back, to do good in this life was coming to an end. That sadness was not weakness. It was the mark of pure faith. Only those who truly live for Allah see every moment as an irreplaceable opportunity. For Ilyas, life was not a place to indulge. It was a field where you plant deeds, and when that field closes, he grieved not because he lost the world, but because he lost the chance to keep serving. When he handed his cloak to Ilyas, it was not just a symbolic act. It was the transfer of responsibility, the declaration that truth does not depend on one individual. Even when a prophet departs, the mission continues. Allah does not let his light go out because one person has completed his role. He always prepares other hearts to carry it forward. Ilyas continued that path not in glory but in a society deeply wounded. What he inherited was not a devoted community but a broken people full of suspicion, division, and exhaustion after years of rebellion. And still, the call did not change. Return to Allah, abandon false gods, restore justice and humility. But history shows a painful reality. People can fall into the same mistake again and again. After Ilyas left, after Ilyas continued to warn, many still returned to the old ways. When a heart becomes used to compromise, even the memory of punishment is not enough to keep it steady for long. And so the trials continued, not to destroy for no reason, but to purify and remind. As time passed, what once made an entire nation tremble slowly vanished. Baal was gone, temples collapsed, priests once mighty were erased by history. No one poured gold at the feet of that lifeless idol anymore, yet the sobering truth is that the spirit of Baal never fully disappeared. Because Baal did not only exist as stone and gold. Baal lives in uncontrolled cravings, in worship of power, money, fame, and the ego. When people place anything above Allah, they build a new Baal, even if they never call it by that name. That is why the story of Ilyas never becomes old. It does not belong to a past era. It reflects directly into today's world. Among all that has disappeared, one thing remains untouched by time: the good name of the prophet Ilyas. Allah says he left for him a good mention among later generations. That is not physical immortality, it is lasting meaning. When his name is spoken, it does not summon images of worldly dominance, but of steadfastness, honesty, and a faith that never compromises. This is one of history's greatest paradoxes. Those who held gold, armies, and towering temples were forgotten. But the man who stood alone, hunted, living among mountains, labeled a troublemaker, is remembered across centuries. That shows how Allah's measure is completely different from the measure of people. The life of the prophet Ilyas asks every one of us a question we cannot avoid. When what feels normal collapses, when power, money, and social approval are gone, what will remain? Will we leave anything behind other than what can be easily erased? This story does not end in despair. It ends with a quiet invitation. It invites people to look at the Baals they are worshipping, to ask what they are bowing to and why. Because in the end, what remains is not what we build for ourselves, but what we are willing to sacrifice for Allah. And that is the true legacy of the prophet Ilyas, a legacy not carved in stone, not stored in gold, but written into the hearts of those who choose truth, even if they must stand alone. The greatest lesson from the life of the prophet Ilyas is not in miracles, but in a way of living. Miracles can scare people for a moment, but only sincere faith creates lasting change. Real change requires the courage to leave what is familiar, to accept loss, and to stand firm even when you stand alone. In today's life, not everyone faces a giant statue, but every one of us will face moments where we must choose between truth and convenience, conscience and benefit, doing what is right and being accepted by the crowd. Applying the lesson of the prophet Ilyas does not mean becoming perfect. It means being honest with your faith, willing to ask yourself what is sitting at the center of your heart and whether it is replacing Allah. This story also reminds us that no sincere effort is wasted. Even when results do not look the way we hoped, Allah values steadfastness, not the size of a following. One person standing firm for truth in the sight of Allah can be worth more than a crowd that compromises with wrongdoing. If this story resonates with you, and you want to keep exploring the history of the prophets not as distant events but as living mirrors for the present, join the Prophetic History Explained community so we can learn, reflect, and grow together through prophetic history, faith, and timeless lessons. And do not forget to subscribe to support Prophetic History Explained, so we can keep bringing you deeper, more carefully crafted, meaningful videos in the episodes ahead.